There is a playbook that empires have used for centuries. It does not begin with armies or warships. It begins with loans. It begins with interest rates. It begins with a signature on a piece of paper that a desperate ruler does not fully understand. And by the time the guns arrive, the conquest is already complete. The military is just there to make it official. This is the story of how Britain turned Egypt from a sovereign nation into an occupied territory. Not through some grand military campaign, but through something far more elegant, far more devastating, and far more relevant to our world today. Debt. It is the story of how a canal dug through the desert became the chain around an entire country's neck. How European bankers dressed up financial predation as civilizing progress. And how a 70-year occupation began not with a declaration of war, but with a balance sheet. To understand how Egypt fell, you first have to understand what Egypt was becoming. Because in the middle of the 1800s, Egypt was not some backwater province. It was one of the most strategically important territories on earth. And it was modernizing at a pace that rivaled parts of Europe itself. The man at the center of this transformation was Muhammad Ali Pasha, an Ottoman military command of Albanian origin who seized control of Egypt in 1805 and proceeded to drag the country into the modern era by sheer force of will. He built factories, reformed the military, overhauled agriculture, and created a centralized state apparatus that gave Egypt genuine autonomy within the Ottoman Empire. His successors continued on this trajectory, and by the 1860s, Egypt looked like a country on the rise. It had railways, telegraph lines, modernized ports, new irrigation systems, and a booming cotton trade that was making serious money. Especially during the American Civil War, when Union blockades of the Confederate South choked off the global cotton supply and sent prices through the roof. Egyptian cotton filled the gap, and money poured into the country like the Nile during flood season. European investors, merchants, and diplomats all suddenly became very, very interested in Egypt. And then came Ismail Pasha. Ismail became the Khedive of Egypt in 1863. Now the title Khedive itself tells you something. It was not officially recognized by the Ottoman Sultan at first because it implied a level of independence that made Istanbul nervous. Ismail had to pay enormous bribes and tributes to convince the Sultan to grant him the title, which gave him significant autonomy over Egyptian affairs. Ismail was educated in Paris. He spoke fluent French. He admired European culture, and he had a dream. He wanted to turn Cairo into the Paris of the Nile and Egypt into a great African power that could stand shoulder to shoulder with any European state. In many ways, this was an admirable vision. He built hundreds of miles of railroad. He constructed scores of bridges, thousands of miles of irrigation canals, and made critical improvements to the harbor at Alexandria. He invested in schools, established Egypt's first modern postal system, expanded the telegraph network, and pushed military expeditions into Sudan, Somalia, and Abyssinia. He even created an assembly of delegates in 1866, a body of local leaders who served as advisors to his administration, something that resembled, at least on the surface, a step toward representative governance. But the crown jewel of Ismail's ambitions, the project that would define his reign and seal Egypt's fate, was something that had already been set in motion before he took power: the Suez Canal. The idea of connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea was not new. Ancient pharaohs had attempted various canal projects linking the Nile to the Red Sea, and Napoleon himself commissioned surveys of the Isthmus of Suez during his Egyptian campaign in 1798. But it was a French diplomat named Ferdinand de Lesseps who finally made it happen. Lesseps secured a concession from Ismail's predecessor, Said Pasha, in 1854 to build a canal directly through the isthmus. The Suez Canal Company was incorporated in 1858 with initial capital of £8 million, divided into 400,000 shares. Said Pasha personally took nearly 177,000 of those shares, close to 44% of the total. French middle-class investors bought up the majority of the rest. The British, notably, refused to invest. In fact, London actively tried to sabotage the project, spreading rumors that the company was bankrupt and that the construction relied on slave labor. And on that last point, they were not entirely wrong. The construction of the Suez Canal is one of the great untold horror stories of the 19th century. The initial plan relied heavily on the corvée, a system of forced labor imposed on Egyptian peasants, the fellahin. Tens of thousands of these workers were rounded up from their villages, sometimes in chains, and marched into the desert. At any given time, an estimated 20 to 30,000 laborers were toiling in the brutal heat, digging through sand, rock, and salt marshes with picks, shovels, and their bare hands. Fresh water was dangerously scarce. The camps were breeding grounds for cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. Thousands died. Over the full decade of construction, estimates suggest that as many as 1.5 million Egyptians were cycled through the forced labor system. The exact death toll is lost to history, but it is widely believed that tens of thousands perished. When Ismail took power in 1863, he abolished the corvée under pressure from Britain and the Ottoman Sultan. But this created a new problem. Napoleon III of France, acting as arbitrator, ruled that Egypt had to compensate the Suez Canal Company for the loss of its free labor force. That compensation bill came to roughly 84 million francs. Egypt was now paying for the privilege of no longer enslaving its own people. The canal took 10 years to build and cost more than double the original estimate, exceeding 400 million francs. When it finally opened on November 17, 1869, it was a spectacular event. Ismail spared no expense. The Empress Eugénie of France attended. The future King Edward VII was there. A brand new opera house was built in Cairo for the occasion. An entire quarter of the city was redesigned. The celebrations were lavish, dazzling, and ruinously expensive. But the canal itself was genuinely transformative. It cut the voyage from London to Bombay from weeks to mere days. It slashed shipping costs. It redrew the map of global commerce. And it made Egypt the most strategically important piece of real estate between Europe and Asia. There was just one problem. Egypt was broke. The cotton boom that had fueled the early years of Ismail's reign collapsed after American Civil War ended, and southern cotton flooded the global market again. The Suez Canal, despite its world-changing significance, did not initially generate the profits that had been expected. And Ismail's modernization projects, while impressive, had been financed almost entirely through European loans taken at ruinous terms. This is where the story gets darker. Because the lending practices of European banks toward Egypt in this period were not just aggressive, they were predatory. When Egypt sought loans on the international market, the terms were punishing. Interest rates at times reached as high as 27%. But it was not just the interest that devastated Egypt. It was the structure of the loans themselves. Many were issued at steep discounts, meaning Egypt would take out a loan for a face value of, say, £32 million, but only receive perhaps 20 million in actual cash. The difference went straight into the pockets of the bankers as fees and commissions. In 1870, Ismail contracted a private loan for over £7 million, but actually received only £5 million. In 1873, he signed an agreement with the banking house of Oppenheim for a massive loan of £32 million to pay off the floating debt. And again, the actual amount delivered was far less than the nominal value. By 1875, Egypt's national debt had ballooned to roughly £100 million, a 14-fold increase from when Ismail took power just 12 years earlier. Let that number sink in. In a little over a decade, the debt increased by a factor of 14. And a staggering proportion of that debt was interest, fees, and commissions that never built a single road or irrigated a single field. The money was being siphoned out of Egypt and into the vaults of European financial houses. The Egyptian peasants, meanwhile, were being taxed to the breaking point. Their crops were being pledged as collateral. Their labor was being extracted to service a debt that was enriching foreign bankers. The whole arrangement was designed, whether consciously or not, to create a dependency that could never be escaped. And so, in the autumn of 1875, Ismail made the most fateful financial decision in Egyptian history. He sold Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal. Here is how it happened. Ismail needed cash urgently to meet upcoming debt payments due in December 1875 and January 1876. He put Egypt's 176,602 shares up for sale. A French banker in Egypt had negotiated a deal to loan the Khedive 85 million francs at 18% interest, using the shares as security. But his backers in Paris refused to ratify the agreement, thinking they could squeeze even better terms. While the French hesitated, British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli moved with breathtaking speed. Parliament was not in session, so Disraeli could not go through official channels. Instead, he sent an emissary to the London banking house of N.M. Rothschild & Sons with a request for an immediate loan of £4 million. When Lionel de Rothschild asked what Disraeli had as collateral, the reply, according to legend, was simply the British government. The loan was approved on a gentleman's agreement with no written documentation. It was, in effect, an unsecured loan for a sum equivalent to several billion pounds today. Disraeli purchased the shares, and within 5 months the British government repaid the Rothschilds. The French government was reportedly furious, but found no support from other European powers. Queen Victoria was delighted. The British public cheered, and just like that, Britain now held a controlling interest in the most important waterway in the world. But the purchase of the Kanal shares did not solve Egypt's debt crisis, it made it worse. The shares Ismail sold had been his last significant asset, and the money he received, £4 million, was a fraction of what was owed. By 1876, Egypt was bankrupt. Ismail could not meet his obligations, and this was the moment that Britain and France had been waiting for. They imposed what was known as dual control, a system in which British and French financial officials took direct management of Egypt's revenue and expenditure. A body called the Caisse de la Dette Publique was established, an international commission designed to ensure that Egypt's creditors were repaid. The commission had sweeping powers. It could direct Egyptian tax revenue straight to European bondholders. It could veto government spending. It could dictate economic policy. On paper, it was a mechanism for financial stabilization. In practice, it was the end of Egyptian sovereignty over its own economy. More than half of Egypt's government revenue was now being diverted to service foreign debt. Egyptian farmers, laborers, and merchants were being squeezed to pay off loans that had largely enriched European intermediaries. Now imagine being an ordinary Egyptian watching all of this unfold. You are a farmer along the Nile. Your taxes have been raised again and again. Your crops are being seized. Foreign officials you have never heard of are now dictating how your government spends its money. Europeans are flooding into your country, taking civil service positions, earning higher salaries than Egyptians, and living under a separate legal system that gives them privileges you do not enjoy. The Khedive, the man who is supposed to be your ruler, is clearly a puppet. And the canal that your countrymen died building is now owned by foreigners who are profiting from it enormously while your family goes hungry. Ismail, to his credit, eventually tried to push back. He attempted to rally public opinion against foreign interference and tried to assert more independence over Egypt's finances. But the British and French were not going to tolerate defiance from a ruler they had already financially conquered. In 1879, they pressured the Ottoman Sultan to depose Ismail. He was replaced by his son, Tufik Pasha, a young man who was far more compliant and who commanded almost no respect from the Egyptian population. Tufik was, in the blunt assessment of history, a puppet, installed to serve European interests, and the Egyptian people knew it. This is the fertile soil from which the first Egyptian nationalist movement grew. His name was Ahmed Urabi, and he was a colonel in the Egyptian army. Urabi was not from the elite Turkish-speaking class that had traditionally dominated Egyptian military and political life. He was a native Egyptian, an Arabic speaker, born to a modest family, and he understood, in a visceral way, the resentment that was building across the country. By the early 1880s, the Egyptian military was a powder keg. European influence had extended into the army itself. Turkish and Circassian officers held the senior positions, while native Egyptian officers like Urabi were passed over for promotion, regardless of their abilities. Soldiers were poorly paid. The ranks were filled with men who came from the same peasant communities that were being crushed by taxation and foreign debt management. In 1881, Urabi and a group of Egyptian officers staged a dramatic confrontation with the Khedive. They marched to Abdin Palace in Cairo with troops behind them and presented Tawfiq with a list of demands, including the dismissal of the war minister, an increase in the size of the army, and the formation of a parliament. Tawfiq, who had little power of his own, was forced to comply. It was a remarkable moment. An Egyptian officer, a man of the people, was standing up to a regime backed by the two most powerful empires in the world. Urabi's movement grew rapidly. He became the Minister of War and Egyptian parliament was convened. Urabi's supporters argued for constitutional government, an end to foreign financial control, and equal treatment for Egyptians in their own country. He was widely popular among soldiers, farmers, merchants, and religious scholars. Even the Islamic establishment issued a fatwa declaring that all Egyptians were brothers, regardless of religion, signaling broad national unity behind the movement. Britain and France watched all of this with growing alarm. In January 1882, they issued a joint note declaring their support for Khedive Tawfiq and their determination to maintain his authority against any forces that might disrupt the status quo. The note was intended as a warning to Urabi and the nationalists, but it backfired spectacularly. Rather than intimidating the movement, the Anglo-French note galvanized it. Egyptians saw it as proof that the Khedive was nothing more than a foreign agent, and support for Urabi surged even higher. In May 1882, a combined Franco-British naval fleet arrived at the harbour of Alexandria. The official justification was the protection of European lives and property. The real motivation was the protection of European financial interests and control over the Suez Canal. The presence of the warships only heightened tensions in the city. On June 11, 1882, everything exploded. Violent riots broke out in Alexandria. The exact cause remains disputed to this day. Some blamed Urabi's supporters, others blamed provocateurs. What is certain is that the violence was devastating. Around 50 Europeans and 250 Egyptians were killed. Greek, Maltese, and Italian businesses were attacked. Parts of the city burned. Europeans began fleeing to the safety of the British ships. Khedive Tawfiq saw his opportunity. He declared Urabi a rebel, accused him of inciting the violence, and aligned himself openly with the British. Meanwhile, Urabi's government ordered the reinforcement of Alexandria's coastal defences, a rational military response to the presence of a foreign battle fleet in your harbour. But the British interpreted this as an act of aggression. An ultimatum was issued, demanding that the Egyptian military dismantle the coastal batteries. Urabi refused. On July 11, 1882, at 7 o'clock in the morning, the first shell was fired. The British Royal Navy bombarded Alexandria for more than 10 hours. The coastal defences returned fire, but with minimal effect. No British ships were sunk. The city was devastated. On July 13th, British Marines landed and occupied what was left. The French fleet, which had also been present, refused to participate in the bombardment and sailed away. France's withdrawal was a critical moment. It meant that this would be a purely British operation. And it meant that when the occupation came, Britain would hold the keys alone. But Alexandria was not the objective. The objective was Cairo, and the objective was Egypt. Lieutenant General Sir Garnet Wolseley was placed in command of a large expeditionary force with orders to defeat Urabi and restore the Khedive's authority. Wolseley first attempted to advance on Cairo directly from Alexandria, but the Egyptian defences at Kafr el-Dawar proved too strong. So, Wolseley changed strategy. He embarked his army and sailed to the Canal zone, landing near Ismailia along the Suez Canal itself. It was a brilliant military maneuver, using the very canal that Egypt had built and lost to stage the invasion. From there, Wolseley advanced inland toward Cairo along the Sweetwater Canal, a freshwater channel that ran parallel to the main route. The decisive battle came on September 13, 1882, at a place called Tel el-Kebir, roughly 110 kilometers northeast of Cairo. Urabi had assembled roughly 18,000 troops behind a line of entrenchments supported by 60 to 75 artillery pieces. Wolseley had about 13,000 British soldiers and 60 guns. But Wolseley had something else: intelligence. He personally conducted reconnaissance of the Egyptian positions and discovered that Urabi's forces did not man their outposts at night. So, Wolseley ordered a night march, advancing his army under cover of darkness in complete silence across the desert. At dawn, the British launched a sudden assault on the Egyptian trenches. The battle lasted roughly an hour. The Egyptians fought with courage, but were overwhelmed. Around 2,000 Egyptian soldiers were killed. British casualties were remarkably light: 57 dead and 380 wounded. The Egyptian army disintegrated. Urabi was captured. Cairo fell the same day without a fight. The British had conquered Egypt, and then they did something clever. They did not annex it. They did not formally declare it a colony. They did not remove the Khedive. Instead, they created something far more insidious, something that historians would come to call the Veiled Protectorate. On paper, Egypt remained part of the Ottoman Empire. The Khedive remained the nominal ruler. Egyptian ministers continued to hold their titles. The Egyptian flag still flew. But behind every minister sat a British advisor. Behind every department was a British administrator. Behind every decision was a British veto. And the man who pulled the strings of this entire system was Evelyn Baring, later known as Lord Cromer. Cromer arrived in Egypt in 1883 as the British agent and consul general, and he would hold that position for the next 24 years, until 1907. On paper, his title was diplomatic. In reality, he was the most powerful man in Egypt. He was the grandson of a banking dynasty, the ninth son of Henry Baring, whose family had founded Baring Brothers, one of London's most prominent financial houses. Cromer had previously served in India and had worked on Egypt's financial crisis in the late 1870s. He understood debt, he understood power, and he understood that the most effective form of control was the kind that did not look like control. Under Cromer, Egypt was reorganized from top to bottom. The primary objective was not Egyptian prosperity, it was debt repayment. Egyptian government revenues were restructured to prioritize payments to European bondholders. More than half of the country's budget was channeled towards servicing the foreign debt. The Caisse de la Dette Publique maintained its stranglehold on Egyptian finances. Cromer invested in irrigation projects, particularly the construction of the first Aswan Dam, completed in 1902, which expanded agricultural production. But this was not done for Egypt's benefit in any altruistic sense. It was done to increase the cotton yield because cotton was Egypt's primary export crop, and increasing its production meant more revenue to service the debt, and more raw material for British textile mills. Egypt's economy under Cromer became dangerously dependent on a single cash crop, making it vulnerable to price fluctuations and tying its economic fate even more tightly to European markets. Cromer also systematically undermined Egyptian education. He cut funding to state schools, arguing that Egypt could not afford them while it was repaying its debts. This was a deliberate strategy. An educated Egyptian population would demand self-governance. An uneducated one would remain compliant. Cromer was remarkably open about his paternalistic philosophy. He believed genuinely that Egyptians were incapable of governing themselves, and that British administration was a benevolent necessity. He wrote extensive annual reports showcasing the progress of his reforms, carefully curating the occupation's public image. He forbade subordinates from publicly disagreeing with his policies, and when he finally left Egypt in 1907, he ordered the staff at the British consulate in Cairo to burn his personal papers. The Veiled Protectorate endured in its initial form for over 2 decades. During this period, Egypt was nominally independent, technically Ottoman, and practically British. The occupation was supposed to be temporary. British politicians, including Prime Minister William Gladstone, who had authorized the invasion, repeatedly stated that British forces would withdraw once order was restored. That withdrawal never came. Every year, there was a new reason to stay. The debt had not been fully repaid. Sudan needed to be reconquered. The Canal needed protection. Stability had not been fully achieved. The excuses multiplied, and the occupation deepened. In 1892, Khedive Tawfiq died and was replaced by his son Abbas Hilmi II. a young man who initially tried to assert Egyptian independence and push back against Cromer's authority. But Cromer was having none of it. He intimidated the young Khedive into submission, making it abundantly clear who held the real power. Abbas Hilmi spent the rest of his reign oscillating between quiet resentment and reluctant cooperation. Meanwhile, the nationalist movement that Urabi had ignited did not die. It evolved. By the early 1900s, a new generation of Egyptian intellectuals, lawyers, journalists, and activists was emerging. They were educated, articulate, and increasingly organized. They had watched Cromer's administration for decades, and they understood exactly what was happening. Egypt was being drained of its resources, denied political agency, and kept in a state of engineered dependency. The Denshawi incident of 1906 became a pivotal moment. In that year, British officers out pigeon shooting in the Nile Delta village of Denshawi had an altercation with local villagers. One British officer was injured and later died, possibly of heat stroke. The British response was savage. A special tribunal was convened. Villagers were sentenced to public flogging, hard labor, and hanging. The punishments were carried out in front of the villagers' own families. The brutality of the reprisals caused outrage not only in Egypt but also in Britain itself, where the new liberal government under Campbell Bannerman was embarrassed by the affair. Cromer resigned the following year in 1907, but his departure changed nothing fundamental. His successor, Eldon Gorst, and then Lord Kitchener continued the same system. British troops remained, British advisors remained, the debt machine kept turning. When the First World War broke out in 1914, the fiction of Ottoman suzerainty finally collapsed. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, fighting alongside Germany and Austria-Hungary. Britain could no longer maintain the pretense that Egypt was an Ottoman territory. On December 14, 1914, Britain formally declared Egypt a protectorate, severing its ties with the Ottoman Empire entirely. The Khedive Abbas Hilmi II, who was in Istanbul at the time and had aligned himself with the Ottomans, was deposed. He was replaced by his uncle, who took the new title of Sultan of Egypt, a title that made him sound independent, but in reality made him even more subservient. Egypt during the war became a massive British military staging ground. Hundreds of thousands of troops passed through. Egyptian labor was conscripted to build roads, railways, and fortifications. Egyptian animals, grain, and cotton were requisitioned for the war effort. Martial law was declared and civil liberties were suspended. The Egyptian people bore enormous burdens for a war that was not theirs, in service of an empire that occupied them. When the war ended in 1918, Egyptians expected something in return. The American president, Woodrow Wilson, had spoken of self-determination for all peoples. The word was supposedly being remade on principles of justice and freedom. Surely, Egyptians believed their time had come. In November 1918, a delegation of Egyptian political leaders, led by Saad Zaghloul, requested permission to attend the Paris Peace Conference to present Egypt's case for independence. The British refused. They would not allow Egyptian representatives to go to Paris. They would not entertain discussions of independence. This refusal ignited the Egyptian Revolution of 1919, one of the most significant anti-colonial uprisings of the 20th century. When the British arrested Zaghloul and exiled him to Malta on March 8, 1919, the country erupted. Students demonstrated in the streets, transport workers went on strike, trade unions organized general walkouts. The strike spread from Cairo to every corner of the country, paralyzing Egypt completely. Rioting broke out. British forces opened fire on demonstrators and killed many people. On March 15th, thousands marched on Abdin Palace in Cairo. The following day, several hundred Egyptian women gathered to protest the occupation in one of the most historic demonstrations in the country's history. They were led by the wives of the exiled nationalist politicians, including Safia Zaghloul and Huda Sha'arawi, and they refused to disperse when British soldiers ordered them to. The revolution forced Britain's hand. Lord Milner was sent to Egypt to find a solution and was met with strikes and unrest wherever he went. Zaghloul was brought to London for talks. The negotiations dragged on. Zaghloul was deported again, this time to the Seychelles. More strikes and demonstrations followed. Finally, on February 28, 1922, Britain issued a unilateral declaration of Egyptian independence. Egypt was declared an independent country. Sultan Fuad became King Fuad I. A new constitution was drafted in 1923 based on a parliamentary system. Saad Zaghloul became the first popularly elected prime minister in 1924 when his Wafd party won an overwhelming majority, taking 195 out of 214 seats. But here is the thing, the independence was a mirage. Britain retained control over 4 critical areas: the security of the Suez Canal and all imperial communications, the defense of Egypt against foreign aggression, the protection of foreign interests and minorities, and control over Sudan. British troops remained on Egyptian soil. The British High Commissioner continued to wield enormous influence. The Suez Canal zone remained a British military fortress. For the next 3 decades, Egypt existed in a strange twilight between nominal independence and practical subjugation. The situation worsened during the Second World War. When the war began in 1939, Britain once again treated Egypt as a strategic military base. In February 1942, British tanks surrounded Abdeen Palace in Cairo and presented King Farouk with an ultimatum: either appoint a pro-British prime minister or be deposed. Farouk capitulated. It was a humiliation that the Egyptian people never forgot. After the war, Egyptian resentment reached a boiling point. The continued British military presence in the Canal Zone became the focal point of nationalist anger. Guerrilla attacks on British forces became common. On January 25, 1952, British forces attacked an Egyptian police barracks in Ismailia, killing roughly 50 Egyptian policemen. The next day, riots erupted in Cairo in what became known as Black Saturday. British-owned businesses, hotels and cinemas were burned. The chaos undermined King Farouk's already fragile legitimacy. 6 months later, on July 23, 1952, a group of reformist military officers, calling themselves the Free Officers, staged a coup, overthrowing King Farouk and the entire monarchy. Among their leaders was a young colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser, who would become the dominant figure in Egyptian and Arab politics for the next 2 decades. The Free Officers movement was, in many ways, the final inheritor of the spirit that Ahmed Urabi had embodied 70 years earlier. Nasser himself explicitly saw Urabi as a predecessor. The Free Officers negotiated a British withdrawal from the Canal Zone, completed in 1956, and then, in a move that sent shockwaves around the world, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal on July 26, 1956, declaring that the revenues would finally belong to the Egyptian people. The canal that had been built with Egyptian labor, that had been sold to pay Egyptian debts, that had been used to justify a 70-year occupation, was finally, at long last, Egyptian again. Britain, France, and Israel responded with a military invasion, the Suez Crisis, but were forced to withdraw under pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union. It was the definitive end of British power in Egypt, and arguably the moment when the sun truly began to set on the British Empire itself. So, what are we left with? A story that spans nearly a century, from the first European loans of the 1860s to the last British soldier leaving in 1956. And when you step back and look at the entire arc, a very clear pattern emerges. First came the loans. Loans issued at predatory rates, with hidden fees and ruinous discounts, to a ruler with grand ambitions and poor financial judgment. Then came the debt crisis, the inevitable moment when the borrower could no longer pay and the creditors moved in. Then came the financial control, the dual control, the caisse de la dette publique, the foreign officials running Egypt's economy for the benefit of European bondholders. Then came the pretext, a nationalist movement that threatened the financial arrangement, riots that endangered European lives, instability that required intervention. Then came the military occupation, swift, decisive, and presented as temporary. Then came the puppet government, the Khedive restored, the parliament defanged, the real power exercised by a British consul who happened to be the grandson of a banking dynasty. And finally came the permanent control, dressed up in the language of civilization, progress, and order. This was not unique to Egypt. This same playbook was used across Africa, across Asia, across Latin America. Debt as a weapon. Financial control as a precursor to political control. Military force as the final enforcement mechanism. The specifics varied, but the architecture was always the same. And the uncomfortable truth is that this architecture did not disappear with decolonization. The mechanisms evolved. The institutions changed their names, but the fundamental dynamic, powerful creditors using financial leverage to extract wealth and political compliance from weaker nations, is something that anyone who follows international economics today would recognize immediately. Egypt's story is not just history, it is a warning. It is a reminder that sovereignty is not just about flags and anthems and borders on a map. Sovereignty is about who controls the money, who holds the debt, who sets the terms. Because when you owe money you cannot repay to people who are more powerful than you, the question is never whether they will come to collect. The question is only when and how they will dress it up when they do. If you made it this far, leave a pyramid emoji in the comments. I want to see how many of you actually stayed for the whole story. And if you are not subscribed yet, now would be a really good time. We are putting out content like this regularly, and I promise you do not want to miss what is coming next. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.